All right, folks, welcome back to the American Praetorians live stream. We got a couple of interesting guests this month. Steve Tarani and Steven Lieberman, who just came out with Sword and Quill. So, Steve, let's start with you. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll get this going.
Steve Tarani, I think that's you. This is what happens when you have two authors with the same name.
Well, you're as Steve on one and Steven on the other, so we'll use that as our differentiation.
All right. Yeah.
It'll just be like Mr. Tarani and Mr. Lieberman. It'll sound very official.
Yeah. Great. Coming from federal contractor / federal employee background in the world of protective services, written a number of books, and this one I got to write with Mr. Lieberman, and it was quite an adventure from the start, I must say.
I will tell you just a little bit of background on us. So my wife Sandy is the CEO of the Artemis Group, which is really our parent company here. We have a training facility here in Southern California, and she had been pushing for me to write a book specifically about the law. And I'm for those who don't know, I'm an attorney, and she has trained with Steve Tarani. In fact, she was the one who really brought Tarani into our facility to teach some of our clients. And she, and Tarani already had a number of books under his belt. It was one of our clients, happens to be one of the publishers of Wargate and our publisher. And Sandy was able to convince Nick to reach out to us and say, look, co-author a book together. The only way that Steven's going to actually get off of his ass and write this thing is if he's got the pressure of knowing that Tarani is going to be doing it alongside with him. So that's kind of how we got into it. I mean, just for the audience's background knowledge here, Tarani's being way too humble on his origin story. He's been involved in this fieldcraft for probably about, I'm going to say 25, 30 years, if not longer. He knows more about physical deployment of force than I will ever know. What I normally do is get involved after the force has been completed. I am primarily a Second Amendment attorney. I started off as a use of force attorney, typically dealing with compliance related issues. And then I do focus very heavily on constitutional law. Our law firm typically will represent military personnel, law enforcement officers, and concealed carry permit holders. So usually there has to be a gun involved. And a lot of what's in the book is sort of like a compendium of both of our experiences together, not just the nuts and bolts of the law or, how to prevent a violent encounter from taking place to begin with, but understanding sort of like the underlying philosophy of the Second Amendment in general. So it's interesting. In fact, when we first were asked to do this, Steve and I had a conversation and we were like, okay, this is a multi-volume edition, potentially, thousands of pages each volume. Nobody's going to read it. I mean, we've got to be able to take it and distill it down into something that's very easily accessible, quickly read, and full of the real nuts and bolts. So ultimately we drafted something that we thought was pretty good, and then we sent it over to our editor, and he completely disassembled it, repackaged it. We looked at it, and we said, "Oh my God, this is way better than we had originally thought." He actually made us sound intelligent, and then it's now it comes available. I think you can go onto Amazon and pre-order it. I think it gets released on, I think it's August 5th, if I'm not mistaken. So
right.
So we're pretty excited about it.
It is. I didn't actually check if it's just a pre-order, if it's up for actual
No, it's. I think it's. I think
it's on the Wargate store already.
Yeah.
But
I do like the dichotomy of like, so working with like the actual law and, litigating the use of force and all that, and then Mr. Tarani's area of expertise, which is applying it, because Pete and I have worked in physical security as well, and it's always in the back of your mind. It's like, what am I allowed to do in this moment or in these situations and all that? And so a lot of times, like, it's not just, hey, I'll do this and then my lawyer will figure it out for me. It's, you have to know this stuff going in ahead of time. And it's the guys like Steve, Pete, myself, who have to like really be focused on like, when in a moment is use of force justified and what level of use of force, and how are you going to explain it? Because a lot of companies, I'm not saying anybody here, but a lot of companies will be like, hey, it's your job to, decide when is use of force, or we're expecting you to do this. And as soon as you do, be like, this is a headache. You're on your own. So you have to figure this out. And we just want to be separate from this incident, even though we hired you to do this in the first place. So.
And a lot of the work that we were doing, particularly overseas, if an incident happened, you could pretty much guarantee you were going to be on the first thing smoking out of the country.
Yeah. I mean, look, I will tell you, just from my world, and this is something that really been kind of interesting, in our sort of development here. We, California, which is where I'm licensed to practice in California and Washington, D.C. And then for a period of time, I was also an Army JAG officer. So but that's really where I was doing most of my rough row briefings and things like that. But we really didn't spend a lot of time training civilians, and California didn't really have a robust gun culture. Starting back in 2014, we started, well, especially here in Orange County where I am, we started issuing concealed carry permits. One of the things that we noticed was that there were a lot of people that were excited to finally be in a position where they could, actually carry a gun, but they only, if they knew how to operate a firearm at all, and even that was questionable, right? Their understanding of professionalism at arms, which is a phrase that we use frequently in the book, simply didn't exist, right? I mean, this was,
right.
They were going to go to guns no matter what, right? Over something that doesn't require lethal use of force. And, we ended up having to defend cases like that. And when Steve started coming in and, being gracious enough to teach a lot of our clients, one of the things that we started noticing is that their professionalism, for lack of a better term, started to develop, right? It was one of the things that we all basically are constantly trying to inculcate is, hey, you know what? If you've gotten to the point where you're making a kinetic, engagement, you really screwed up. I mean, this is a direct affront to you. So
there wasn't a lot of de-escalation tactics that people had when that first popped off, right? Like they thought, well, I've got a gun, I got to do this now.
Yeah, or just even allowing themselves to get there. Like I shamelessly have stolen Steve's material. Whenever I do one of our CCW classes, I always tell them, I give you credit, Steve, by the way, for this phrase, but I always tell them, hey man, if you go to guns, you've lost. And that's always sort of our starting off point. Actually, Steve, if you want to explain where that came from, I think it's pretty important.
Sure. Yeah, working in protection, both Pete and Coop know this. You get a pre-deployment briefing and all the details and all that in-country stuff. And one time we had a Papa Smurf up there. Guy's got nearly 40 years experience, really seasoned operator. And he says to us, and you got to, for pre-qual, you can't even get on the airplane unless you're qualified, et cetera, et cetera. So the guy, he starts off the briefing with, if you boys go to guns, you failed. And we just kind of all the gorillas paused forward, looking at each other like,
Yeah. But we like guns.
exactly. Mongo like gun, So
Yeah.
so he said that think about it. You're doing your thing, and your very first and only response is go to guns. You immediately escalate to the highest use of force option available in that scenario, and you've immediately simultaneously placed your protectee in the highest level of danger possible. And so what he said was, you failed. There's 90 things you could have done instead of that, and you didn't exhaust them. You didn't even enter that spectrum yet. You went right to guns. So if you do that, you failed.
Right.
My version.
So it's like not even if nobody's armed, just getting into a fight in, like, say, a bar or something. It's like there's no winner there. You either lost the fight or you won the fight, and now there's legal ramifications. And it's like,
oh yeah.
I got real good at, like, de-escalation, just not in the job at all. It's because it's like, man, I got a clearance. I'm not trying to get into a fight over some stupid, ego stuff in a bar.
Yeah. So a lot of this typically, although not exclusively, right, but this typically tends to manifest in men that have fragile egos, right, and they're willing to try to impose their force on other people.
They got something to prove.
They got something to prove, right? And one of the things that we've explained is, like, look, a lot of law enforcement agencies have a standing policy. In any sort of physical confrontation, one person's going to go to jail, the other one's going to go to the hospital. That's it. Okay. We're not interested in knowing who the initial aggressor was. We're not interested in doing any level of investigatory analysis. We're going to let these two combatants gas themselves out, right? Because we don't want to sit there and actually, like, try to, put ourselves at risk. So we'll let them gas themselves out. Yeah. Well, whoever looks like they're hurt the most, they'll go to the hospital. The other guy goes to jail. So it's like, okay, so you think that you're the best hand-to-hand fighter in the world. Good for you. You now are going to be spending 12 hours in jail. Okay. So, and we'll even assume, for the sake of argument, that you were the victim, that, the other guy was the aggressor to you. You got this coming, right? You didn't have to fight back. Now, sometimes we get to a level where, hey, self-preservation kicks in. I mean, this is legitimately going to, result in you being injured or killed. And then, you can't be going through that level of analysis. You got to survive this experience. Fair enough. We get that. But yeah, I mean, we look at our law cases, and as we start dissecting the fact patterns, we're like, and my law partner and I do this all the time. We start making these little off-ramp signs, on our whiteboard. This could have terminated here. This could have terminated here. This could have terminated here, right? And we're putting little plus signs next to that to effectively say, okay, it could have terminated. It didn't. Is this going to necessarily kill my case, right? I mean, is this going to make it that much more difficult to litigate? And sometimes we ultimately have to go to the client and say, look, you're hosed. I mean, your actions, there's just simply not going to be 12 people that are going to find your actions reasonable, And we deal with it, right? I mean, fortunately, we're pretty successful at preventing these cases from going to trial in the first place. But it's always a battle. So, yeah.
My version downrange was, our job was to keep the client out of trouble. Failing that, to kill as many people as necessary to get the client out of trouble.
Yeah. You know what? Those are, so that's actually, you guys bring up something that's really kind of interesting. Steve and I have actually had this conversation several times before. Dealing with contractors and sending people downrange into hostile territories where they've got very, very, very specific mission objectives, that is radically different from the rules of use of force that a civilian who happens to be an accountant, is going to be going through, right? I mean, they're not carrying a gun because they need to know how to properly assault a compound. They're carrying a gun because they need to get from their office to their BMW. That's exclusively it, right? Now the skill sets oftentimes are different, but the mindset is fundamentally different as well, right? And we deal with that. I mean, we mentioned it in the book. There's a lot of people that will do what, the proverbial high speed, low drag kind of training. And it's like, okay, that's fantasy camp. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's actually kind of enjoyable. I mean, I do it. It's kind of neat. But, if we get to the point where I have to be able to use, an AR-10 to shoot at a moving vehicle from a hospital or from a helicopter rather, we've effectively had societal collapse at that point. Okay. If you got a 55-year-old guy hanging out of a helicopter as a civilian shooting at moving vehicles, the real question is, okay, do you understand judgmental use of force in a civilian type setting? Right. We run into this too with some of our ex-military guys, especially guys that were doing contracting, that now find themselves back home in a civilian environment. And it's like, okay, we've got to really start driving in those left and right lateral limits now, because
they're not foreign nationals. They're your neighbors. Like, stop treating them like war zone. And it's also like, okay, the foreign contractor in a hostile environment, it both comes down to the same questions of, like, your case is going to hang on what did you do to avoid this scenario that you had to use lethal force in. And on the civilian side of things, you have a lot more options to that, because as a contractor with physical security in mind, like, could you have avoided this? Like, well, no, I had to go where the client was. The client was in a spot where some guy wanted my client dead, and I had to take action to prevent that. Whereas, like, in stateside and in everyday civilian life, it's like, all right, did you have to go down that alley, or did you have to go down to this part of town? Did you have to get into an argument with this guy? Did you have blah, 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 blah. And so there's a lot more factors that are going to be weighed against you in a peacetime civilized area,
Well, yes, 100%. And I mean, I will also tell you, so it's funny, whenever Steve is teaching a class at the Artemis Defense Institute, usually, but not exclusively, he's typically teaching an edged weapons class, and the question invariably comes up, well, if I use this kind of knife, this kind of stick, or this kind of, improvised tool, is that going to get me into some sort of legal, thing? And Steve's actually really good about, saying, yeah, you don't want to ask me that question. That's, the question to ask me, Steve. Right. And my response to that is always the same thing. It's like, I don't know. It depends on your zip code. Right. I mean, I can take, I can take a fact pattern, especially in a place like California, right? I can take a fact pattern and present that fact pattern to a jury in Newport Beach and come to an entirely different result with the exact same fact pattern presented to a jury in San Francisco. I mean, the same state, it's the same penal code, right? And yet the demographics are radically different. So,
different jurors, right?
Different jurors, a lot of our, a lot of the people that have chosen to bear arms are what we sometimes refer to as pathologically law-abiding citizens, and they want to know the way, right? I mean, is there, is this going to get me arrested? And that seems to be the overriding concern. And again, it's always like, I have no clue. It's largely going to be dependent on where it took place. Now here's the reality: if you didn't carry your gun, if you didn't train on a regular basis, if you weren't hyper aware of your surroundings, and you found yourself in this situation and you chose not to use force, well, then you would have died, because the threshold question is, was there a reasonable belief that there was an imminent likelihood of death or great bodily injury? So if that answer is yes, and you didn't do anything, then the inevitable result is that you're dead. So if you're telling me that you're not going to train, you're not going to bear arms, you're not going to, well, that means that you're effectively suicidal. That doesn't make any logical sense. Right?
And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who do think that way.
Yeah.
Are you guys at all familiar with a YouTube channel called Armed Attorneys?
The guy and the gal down in Texas? Yeah.
Were you aware? I think it was last year or the year before they really stepped in it when they basically told people not to carry trauma kits because they might get in trouble.
So I stopped really heavily paying attention to them when they suggested that training could be potentially problematic.
Right.
And I remember having a conversation with one of our law enforcement officers that trains here, and I said, I don't recall ever seeing a cop who survived a gunfight to be lying in bed with tubes coming out of his body saying, yeah, you know what, if only I didn't have this much training. Right. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. And if you're sitting there, if you are legitimately so risk averse that you're considering that carrying a trauma kit is going to potentially lead to a prosecution or to civil liability, you shouldn't be carrying a weapon. It's that simple, right? So you're going to carry a gun, but you're not going to carry a Band-Aid. I mean, that just doesn't make any,
I think it was kind of an overreaction to that instance in, I think it was Arizona, Steve, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the guy, I think he was a cop. He shot an individual, and on the inside of the ejection port cover, he had like "you're fucked" written on it. And so they used that. I don't know if that actually sunk his case or not, but they used that to argue that he was using malicious intent. And so I think everything downstream of that has either been an overreaction to one side or the other. Like, hey, this shouldn't matter, whatever. Or it's like, well, don't carry Band-Aids because that means that you expected violence to happen, So.
Which is utterly retarded. But
so I will say, and then I'll let my co-author jump into. I'm taking all of his thunder, but in that particular case, which was an off-duty SWAT operator using his own personal weapon system, and he had a dust cover that said that. So one of the things that we've seen in our community is that people speak with extreme authority, and there is no room for any level of disagreement, right? If I tell you X and you disagree with me, well, you're clearly a moron because I simply know more than you do. Now I'm making it up, but nonetheless, I know more than you do, right? And you certainly see that on YouTube, and you certainly see that on the internet. And when that whole thing first came about, most of us in the legal community said it's extraordinarily doubtful that the dust cover and the words are even going to be admitted to trial, because one of the threshold questions that we ask when we look at evidence is whether or not that evidence is more prejudicial than probative. And what was really being litigated here was whether or not the cops' actions were reasonable, which they ultimately were found to be reasonable, which I personally actually have an issue with. I think they weren't, but the dust cover, we all knew that wasn't even going to be brought before a jury. The prosecutor wanted to, but there was
it was brought into the media, but not maybe not the jury.
Probably out there in the media. But I mean, we hear that kind of stuff all the time, and unfortunately, that look, a lot of people, especially people that have not taken advantage of going through constant, consistent, repetitive training with purpose. They own a gun, or they own a knife or something like that. Maybe they go to the range occasionally and they put holes in targets. If they do any sort of research or monitoring, websites or YouTube videos or stuff like that, they tend to find 2 or 3 people that they may very well have a sort of almost a hero worshiping of. And hey, if he said it, it's gold. Or if she said it, it's gold. And it's like, well, yeah, in many circumstances it might be, but not all. I mean, you got to go through this philosophical introspection. You got to be open-minded to a certain degree as well. So
that's good stuff.
So there's a part of the book I'd like to bring this up because it's related to the discussion. Is when folks look at response, Okay, I'm going to respond. If such and such a thing happens, I'm going to do this. Some folks have that mindset, my secret move, I can come out of AIWB in 1.5, that whatever their responses will be. And what usually isn't taken into context is what I call 0 to 100. And Steve and I use this example in the book a lot. And what it is, you find yourself at the 90. That's where, you're against the wall with a Glock in your face or knife on your throat, whatever. That's the 90. 90 to 100 is the last 10%. What you didn't notice at 80 was that they were following you out of the store. What you didn't notice at 70 was they watched you go into the store. What you didn't notice at 60 and so on and so forth, all the way up to 0. You could have solved the problem 0 to 90 using your soft skills. And as a result of that failure, you now find yourself in a situation where you're denied that proactive opportunity, can only react. And then from there, you have, defensive tactics, hand-to-hand, edge weapons, impact weapons, firearms, fill in the blank. But that's a 10% solution to a 100% problem.
And this is exactly why I like the movie Ronin better than I like John Wick, is because it's not just about the gunfights or the car chases. Like, a lot of that movie is Robert De Niro's character figuring out the location before he even goes in there, and like using those soft skills to
and ambition, a cup of coffee.
yeah.
You know what? I mean, but it's interesting that you mentioned, because I see this all the time too, right? Where we'll have our trainees that are really, really, really focused on developing mastery at skill at arms, right? And they do. I mean, they become very, very competent in using their particular weapon systems. But you guys know, in any sort of physical engagement, whether it's ballistic or non-ballistic, you're going to be having an adrenaline dump. You're going to be having physiological responses. You're going to be physically exhausted. Okay. And, in a very short period of time, and you're looking at this person and you're thinking, you may survive the gunfight, but you're going to have a freaking heart attack. I mean, you need to, it can't just be about the gun. You need to start working on your diet. You need to start working on, all these other aspects. And people have become so like totemistic about the gun. Right. And I mean, that was one of, and my contribution to the book was to really look at it and say, look, this is, Steve and I are both huge advocates for the Second Amendment. So, I mean, I don't want to suggest that there's any level of, daylight between the two of us on that. But it was like, okay, well, if we're going to be looking at the Second Amendment, we're going to consider this to be sort of our empowering right. Just sitting and throwing out witty phrases about the Second Amendment or having Mullen Lobby on the back of your windshield or something like that's not sufficient. I mean, you have to kind of understand where the philosophy of the Second Amendment, why the framers were even talking about this, right? And I mean, we do go through in the book a certain level of historical development of, okay, so this doesn't go back just simply to 1791. This actually goes back to when we were first crawling out of the ooze, okay, and where that whole thing came from. And frankly, and we put it in the book too. I mean, we're philosophical. I think Steve and I both, we're philosophical purists when it comes to the Second Amendment. That can lead to some pretty controversial conclusions, right? I mean,
right.
We suddenly, we have these incidences of, illegal aliens being caught in possession of firearms and prosecuted for that. And it's like, well, wait a minute, by all means, deport them. By all means, level whatever sort of penal code violations against them that you can. But when it comes to making an argument that they have a right to bear arms, so the Second Amendment isn't a right that's been granted by the government. It's a right that was recognized by our framers, pre-existed. And the Declaration of Independence tells us where that right emanated from, and that's the Creator. Okay, and if a God character granted humanity with this right to live, this right to exist, And the Second Amendment recognizes that you have a right to use violence in order to prevent your extinction, right? You can't really think of a theological argument that God would say, well, I'm only going to grant this right of self-preservation for the people that live in this area called North America. I mean, that just doesn't make any cosmological sense, right? So it's like,
no, but it works in manifest destiny terms. But yeah,
it's not, well, without question. Yeah.
but no, I see where you're going.
It's a human right, right? And you know, again, I'm not suggesting that, you know, and I've gotten a lot of flack over, you know, making that statement where people are like, you advocate illegal aliens owning guns. It's like, no, I actually do believe that we should probably be deporting people. I mean, I'm okay with that.
You advocate the gun part, not the illegal alien part. That's
exactly
where
it's
they get, you know.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like so in that respect, I do become a philosophical purist, right? But you know that, and we threw it in the book too. It's like, look, this isn't. Steve is a master. I mean, when it comes to his understanding of what leads up to a conflict and actually being able to survive a conflict, in my entire existence, Steve is an absolute master. My area is on the philosophical underpinnings that led to Steve being able to survive in the first place. Right. And we think that those two need to be joined together. I mean, the book is an academic book, but it's we think it's an accessible academic book. Right. And then, you know, we threw war stories in there too, because what the hell, you know, we've had some, you know, it's funny because we look at certain situations where you look at clients and they've been arrested, they've been prosecuted, and you're looking at that and you're like, the hell were you thinking? I mean, you know, like, how did you think this was eventually going to come about? I mean, you know, it's like, okay, you know.
It works for Steven Seagal. So.
Yeah, there you go.
So to give more on that, Steve, you know, between Steve and I've been in this for 37 years. Steve's been in for almost the same. And, you know, combined, in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of students over the decades. And we always got the same questions that came up over and over and over again. So kind of that was really the baseline for this book, was Steve and I answering those same questions that came up in you know, on the range or in a class or whatever the situation was. And we kind of accumulated, you know, what are those questions? And we sort of, like, these kind of questions are in category A, these are in category B. So we kind of broke all the questions down into categories and responded to those categories in an order, you know, in a structured manner. That's the guts of the book.
Yeah.
What was your favorite question to answer in the book? Like, what was the one where, when you guys set out on this, be like, this is the one that I want to make sure we include, because if you've either got a lot to say about it, or it's just interesting to you, or what's going on with that? Like, what's your favorite question that you attempted to answer?
I'm going to state mine and then hand it over to Steven.
All right.
It might be the same one. You know what? If something happens, I'm just going to shoot him.
Yep. That's why you're my brother.
It's amazing though, because that has problems, like, both philosophically and practically, because the best piece of advice I got when I was young at this was like, oh, like, you carry concealed and all that stuff. Do you know how to wrestle? No? Then how are you just going to shoot? Like, you can't. Nobody just jumps out 20 feet from you. It's like, hi, I'm here to assault you. Like, you know, they're going to get in close before the altercation starts. So you need to be able to make sure that you can draw your weapon, let alone just shoot him. You'll just shoot him. Yeah. While you're in a fucking, you know, rear naked choke.
I will tell you, for me, okay, and it's right up at the front of the book. I got called out on it was not one of our clients. It was you know, one of our Artemis clients. It was actually an insurance client. This guy had self-defense insurance, had been involved in some sort of altercation. The insurance company contacted me and said, hey, we're going to cut, you know, you need to represent this guy. So I run out to the scene, and it's still an active homicide investigation at the time that I get there. And I'm meeting with my client. It's in a very, very economically depressed area of Los Angeles. There's a tremendous amount of crime, right? Demographically, I'm sort of standing out like a sore thumb, at this crime scene. And it turns out that there were a bunch of tweakers that were trying to break into this guy's work vehicle in the middle of the night. This guy comes out of his house with his $3,000 Glock 19. So let your mind wrap around that one, right? So he comes out, and as confronts the tweakers, they get into this minivan. They start driving off, and he starts shooting, and he ends up killing one of them. And I'm talking to the client, and he's kind of working me through the story, and I'm trying to think of defenses, and I'm like, well, I mean, you felt your life was in danger, right? I mean, it wasn't like you were just shooting at the vehicle as it was driving away. And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, it was. He goes, I was trying to mark the license plate so that I could identify the vehicle later on. And I'm like, I'm looking at this dude's hardware, right? I mean, he's got Daniel defense rifles. He's got, he's got Zevs and everything else. And I'm like, you got all this stuff. Have you ever done any training? And he goes, yeah. And he starts rattling off a number of places that he had gone through, and pretty high end, right? And I'm like, did anyone tell you it's not a good idea to be shooting at a license plate to mark the vehicle? And he just kind of looked at me like I pissed in his Wheaties or something. He's like, no. And
I thought this was America.
I got back home that evening. In fact, you know what, Steve? This was during one of your classes. I was going to be taking class. Yeah. And, in fact, I've always said I'm going to take one of his full weekend courses, and I'm never able to do it because I always get called out on a case. But I was telling Sandy, this is a failure of our industry. I mean, when civilians, you're a contractor and you're going to take a class. Okay, you're taking the class because it's usually some level of a prerequisite to actually going on a deployment, or it's because it's a condition of your employment, or you're maybe a cop or in the military, you're being paid to take this class, right?
Right.
But with civilians, they're paying to do this, right? And if civilian comes into a gun class, they want to shoot, right? And I mean, that's like the whole point. They don't want to sit there and listen to some bald lawyer talk about, when not to shoot. They want to be out on the range. And I thought, this guy had absolutely no idea. Nobody ever told him that this was the wrong thing to do. There was an absolute absence of professionalism at arms, on something like this. So apparently
there's also a lapse of know your target and consider its background.
Yeah, well, the 4 safety rules kind of like, you know what, you got to remember in this particular community, those 4 safety rules are suggestions. Okay. I mean, it was not a good shooting. We'll leave it at that.
That wouldn't even have crossed my mind, because if I'm in that situation and it's like, okay, I need to know his license plate, I'm just gonna read the numbers, or I'm gonna, depending on how accessible it is, I'm gonna take out this and take a photo of it. But or from the comfort of your bedroom, you call 911. Right.
I mean, it's like, hey, well, I guess I'm filing another insurance claim. And since this is the 7th time my vehicle's been broken into in this neighborhood, maybe it's time we move. I mean, that's because this isn't going away. I mean, there's like foundational things that this guy could have done, but
that's at 0 to 70 right there. It's just move out of that neighborhood.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's part of it. But that to me is probably that was one of those. That was for me. That was one of those moments that when I looked at this and I thought, we've got to change up everything when it comes to training here. We cannot be so focused on, you we're able to hit a piece of paper at 3, 5, and 7 yards, go carry a gun. I mean, it's it's funny, it's interesting because you referenced Robert De Niro and Ronin, and obviously there's the samurai concept behind that and I've always thought, especially in California, other states are different. In constitutional carry states, there's no training requirement, right? But in a place like California, we have a 16-hour training requirement prior to carrying a gun or prior to getting a CCW. And I always say, I want you to imagine a samurai warrior, right? And it's 1600s feudal Japan, and this guy's magnificent. I mean, he's in full regalia, and he's got this cross that he's doing his katanas on, and every muscle movement is exquisite. Now I want you to take him out of this picture, replace him with a 14-year-old modern day boy with a tube of cardboard from his mom's wrapping paper dispenser. He's just beating the shit out of this cross, right? I go, that's your continuum, right? You've got the samurai warrior, you've got the 14-year-old boy. And no one today would imagine back in feudal Japan, some person going up to a samurai warrior and saying, hey, got this letter from the emperor that says if I take a 16-hour class with you, I'm going to be a samurai. Okay, well, you know what? Yeah, over the next weekend, go ahead and wave the sword around for a while, and then you're a samurai. I mean, we already know that's going to take a lifetime of dedicated practice and discipline, right? Our pistols, those are modern samurai swords, right? Why do we have a difference? Yeah.
The issue comes from a philosophical standpoint of the Second Amendment and the human right to self-preservation. You should have no requirement to carry the gun. However, that is a terrible idea, which is why you need the culture to change to nurture that respect for expertise and that drive to be competent with firearm. Because it goes back to the application when it's actually practical. Nobody rises to the occasion. What happens is they fall to their level of mastery. So it's like the less training you have, because adrenaline doesn't make you superhuman. It turns your legs into jelly. And you're like trying to fight that. So the more used to the action and the more muscle memory you have and the more considerations that you've just drilled into your head, the better you're going to do when you have that adrenaline rush going through you and it's chaos around you. And you can't get that in the 16-hour course. You can't get that in a familiarization course. You have to actually train that. And that can't be done through legislation. That has to be done through the people that take this seriously.
No, it's the culture. And it's peer pressure. Okay. I mean, it's look, one of the things that I try to inculcate with all of our students is that this thing that you are doing, bearing arms, okay, this is the most rugged, individualistic activity a human being could do, right? The preservation of your own existence. And yet you are part of a collective, okay? Your idiot behavior potentially could affect Steve's rights, my rights, your rights, okay?
Right.
So, you need to be competent. You need to develop that mastery and skill at arms. But professionalism at arms is that understanding that your actions can have direct ramifications on everyone else. That's that peer pressure that also needs to take place. I'm with you, Coop. The woman who realizes that she's about to be victimized, okay, with absolutely no weapons experience whatsoever, needs to have the ability to be able to go and acquire a weapon right now. Okay, no waiting periods, nothing like that. It needs to have. That's the philosophical purity. Okay. But it's also a really freaking bad idea. We'd really like to be able to get a hold of her way before that type of event ever starts taking place.
0 to 70.
Yeah.
And again, some of that is, unfortunately, an uphill battle these days because, I mean, Larry Correa got into it years ago about people blaming him. He was victim blaming for wanting to train women to defend themselves and avoid trouble. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, unfortunately, unlike what I think and a lot of people think, even a police academy stint is not going to give you the training that you need. Now, I've trained law enforcement, and it was appalling.
I mean, look, statutory minimum.
Getting to your highest level of mastery when your highest level of mastery is hitting a pie plate at 3 yards with half of your rounds.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not going to sit here and be like, hey, if that's all you can do, you're trash. You have no business being. It's like that. No, that's better than nothing.
It's better than nothing. But it's
like continue past that, right?
So I'm a post-certified instructor, right? I train cops all the time. Okay, and I mean we love our law enforcement. We encourage our law enforcement to train. My attitude is very clear, right? If I, as a lawyer, I have certain professional responsibilities when providing legal care to my clients. I have to be able to articulate to them the status of their case. I have to be able to articulate before a jury with a zealous level of advocacy. I have to know the underlying law, right? And I have to be able to develop a fairly robust network of contacts that I can utilize to, get the best result for my client. And then maybe that's something that's totally non-judicial, right? Maybe the fact that I know these particular people and I have a relationship with them can off-road a case or something along those lines. So I have this sort of continuing, ongoing professional responsibility to be as competent in every aspect of my craft as possible. As a cop, you're wearing a gun. Okay, so you better be able to work your radio. You better be able to be a master of defensive driving techniques. You better understand the penal code. And since, since you're carrying that tool, that sidearm or that patrol rifle, you better be competent in using that. And, unfortunately, I've met, not a lot, but I have met enough that it's anecdotally relevant, police officers that, and frankly, I've seen this in the military as well too, that are, it's just not my thing. Okay, well, you know what? You got it on your hip. It's your thing. Yeah. That's like me sitting there saying, well, yeah, I'm really good at writing a brief, but I can't argue in front of a jury. Okay, well, you know what? Then
isn't that what a paralegal is? Like,
yeah, exactly. It's like, you figure out, I mean, it's like, that's not, don't be going into court, I mean, that's, so.
That also brings up an interesting thing to think about is how many people pour their heart and soul into like professional advancement, not just like getting promoted, but being good at their craft to, like help their company or like, respond correctly to their boss and all that. But when it comes to actually protecting their life and the lives of those around them that they care about, they put nothing into that, or they put the bare minimum into it. It's just something curious about the way we go through life.
It's interesting, right? I mean, like weapon craft. I use that. So one of the things that we talk about in the book too, the Second Amendment doesn't mention firearms anywhere in the Second Amendment, right? I mean, so I mean, I don't want to sound like it's like, I mean, I like shooting guns. I'm not going to lie, right. Okay, but that's but it's a much broader concept than that. So Sandy, she very early on recognized that our industry, the training industry, is typically seminar based. Right. I mean, people go to a class and then they self-study and then they go to class later on. And she was like, no, we're going to, this is the quintessential American martial art. Right. So we are going to treat it as though it is a martial art. And, at Artemis, we've got about 850 members that come in and train at usually in a weekly basis, not just shooting at a paper target. I mean, they're actually going through some level of judgmental use of force and defensive tactics. I love my members because as a lawyer, I never defend my lawyer. Right? I mean, they literally, by going through this rigorous, consistent training, they never utilize my services. I mean, typically, whenever I end up defending a client, it's it's somebody that's never been to Artemis before, and I mean, it's funny too, because when Steve comes out and does one of his programs at Artemis, the clients that take his classes are doing it for the same reason. These people are gun people usually, right? But they want to know how to use a non-ballistic tool to defend themselves. They want to know how to use an impact weapon or a knife, right? I mean, that's how Steve taught Sandy, my wife, how to use the karambit. And that was really the and then Sandy made the mistake of trying to teach me how to use the karambit. And
how many fingers you have?
I was going to say I'm much more of a danger to myself than to others when I'm holding a knife in my hand. I mean, that's we'll leave it at that. So, but
the danger to others thing is, I think that doesn't necessarily. I mean, there's this sort of reflexive right to self-defense, and yes, you absolutely have that. But 20 years ago, in a Marine Corps shooting package, getting ready to go to combat, it was still beaten into us. You're responsible for every round you put downrange.
Yep.
And we were in the house. If you shot a flyer, if you missed, or if you shot the hostage, you were running the hill in full gear and putting your name on the white cross up on top of the hill.
Yep.
And
as well it should be.
And that seems to be a mindset that I don't even necessarily see in a cop who's waiting for the acorn to drop.
So you made
it was a very scary acorn, though.
Yeah. But you made a comment, Coop, which I think is absolutely true, right? I mean, we already know that you go through a massive physiological change during any sort of violent encounter, and that's one of the things that we kind of explain to people, and it's one of the reasons why we use use of force simulators here as well. It's like you may be the greatest shot in the world when you're in a static field, but when your life's on the line, you've got to figure. You got to figure there's going to be a percentage of physiological degradation that's going to take place, right? And if you're getting 1-inch groups at 25 feet, you figure you're probably looking at 6-inch groups at 25 feet, or maybe 7-foot groups at 25 feet. I mean, it's because if you're standing still, you're doing it wrong anyways, right? Yeah. So I mean, there's that whole thing, and we call them recreational shooters, right? We get recreational shooters that come in and they suddenly find themselves put into these types of positions, and they're like, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back to being a recreational shooter.
Right. Yeah.
Like, okay. Well,
there's a difference between a shooter and a fighter. That's I'm sure you guys have gotten into this argument. I'm not going to say either side is right or wrong, but is it easier to treat or teach a very well disciplined and skillful shooter combat tactics than it is to take somebody who's like a soldier or a Marine or somebody or a cop that is trained in tactical shooting and teach them competition shooting? And my argument to that is shooting is arithmetic. Tactics is calculus. You use one and the other, but there's a lot of other stuff going on in a tactical situation, and shooting is 20% of it. The shooting skills that you would cultivate as a shooter is 20% of it. A lot of it is fields of fire, looking for escape routes, what all is going on, who's friendly, who's not, what are potential threats, what are, who are, it's just so much is going through your mind. And it's factoring in, what are your resources, not just your opportunities, but how much stuff do you have on you that you can utilize in this situation? And factoring in civilians and the no shoots is a big part of that. And an even bigger part of that is something that probably you and Steve focus on a lot, which is when am I going too far? When am I shooting the license plate to market versus when am I supposed to disengage and all that? So
well,
that's what I would say about that. But that's some stuff that Artemis would do in a weekly basis.
Yeah, that's
once per quarter seminar.
I actually really want to hear what Steve's response to it.
So and I'm totally on your side, Coop. I did similar work, and I right up there with you 100%. In a civilian application, the viewpoint allowing yourself a wider scope of understanding of the situation. For example, in a civilian setting, is it a shooting solution or is it a tactical solution? I'm with my family in a mall or whatever, and there's a door. There's an exterior door with a brick wall, and I'm here with my 2 kids. And the shooters, I'm just making this up, 25 yards away, and I'm armed and I'm skilled, and I went to Artemis. I have the capability. And I've made the decision that now I don't believe this. I've decided this is not a shooting solution. This is a tactical solution. So I open that door, grab the kids, go outside behind the brick wall, close the door, and get to the car. Problem solved.
Yeah. And there's going to be, say, even if you're, it can apply to a civilian situation, but say like you really got to end this threat, right? Do you have to go in guns blazing and chase down the threat, or can you contain him because there's nobody else that's at danger from him? Have you cordoned him off? Does he have access to targets, right? And it's like, so that it's a constantly changing geometry of the situation that you need to factor in, which, as much as I love competition shooting, that's not factored into those courses. So that's where this argument happens. But that's also, you can go to a shooting seminar like once a quarter and get those shooting skills if you stay at home and retain them and maintain them. But you're not going to get everything that goes into a tactical situation and looking for those tactical solutions unless you're doing this, say, on a weekly basis, or at least something a little bit more frequent, because it goes back to the samurai thing. He's doing that every day. He's not just doing it like for 30 minutes a day. He's practicing day in and day out at this stuff. So
I will also say there is value in that taking place in a communal environment as well. Right. I mean, I can sit there, me and Steve, and he's just looking at my shooting proficiency, or he's just looking at my, speed to contact, or, whether or not I'm employing proper judgmental use of force. But if it's just the 2 of us, okay, number one, there becomes a certain level of repetition taking place. But more than that, I don't have 14 other eyeballs watching me, potentially learning from me, putting that pressure on me, making me responsible for my own actions, having them actually sit there and say, you know what, this brings up an interesting philosophical point that none of the other 13 people even realize, right? And having that kind of discussion. And then, quite frankly, this kind of gets old after a while too, right? I mean, it's like, okay, I know I'm supposed to go and train, but I really want to watch Dancing with the Stars tonight, right? And it's like, and I'm going to sit there and I'm going to make the decision. Now I'm going to stay home rather than go and actually do it. Well, when you suddenly have that communal environment, now it's like, yeah, I mean, it's iron sharpens iron. I get that, right? But it's also more along the lines of, I've actually become kind of good friends with these people.
Yeah, it's your club,
Yeah,
like
well, exactly. I mean, and there's value in that as well. So.
Right. Before we go, I do want to ask a question that was in the comments before we.
Yeah.
So Lauren Moore was asking for you, Steve Tarani, what are the elements of excellence should an average gun owner train in if they can? Like, what's a good baseline for excellence?
You brought up the main point, Coop, and that is being aware of your environment. Number one, environmental mapping. Being able to control your battle space. That's number one. Having solutions available, having your soft skills equal to, if not greater than, your hard skills. Here's an overall viewpoint in response to that question, and I like to present this to all of our viewers and listeners tonight. Think about from the time you were, let's say, 4 years old, 5 years old, very young, to today, whatever number of years or decades that is, and think about what percentage of that time did you have to go to hard skills versus what percentage of that time did you use your soft skills or could have used your soft skills, and just whatever those numbers are, and consider, will those percentages change from here going forward? And to me, that is the areas of expertise that should be focused. If you're spending most of that percentage on soft skills, you need to spend some time. Most people, I'm just going to shoot, forget soft skills. I don't need that. Well, you do, right? It's part of the equation. And that's why Steve and I really emphasize the value of both sides of that coin, both the soft skills and the hard skills, the balance between the two, and the consequence of neither.
And I just want to add to that, for anybody who's very black-pilled and doomer, it's like, oh, we're just going to be in Civil War in 2 years, so I just need to learn to shooting. Pete and I were in a pretty long war together. We used our soft skills just as much as we did our hard skills. Like in a war zone, you're also using the soft skills. You're not just using shooting. So
the only other thing that I would add to that was, Steve, that was like freaking elegant, by the way, what you just said.
I've been hanging around you so much. You're rubbing off.
All right, I'll buy the book. You convinced me.
The only thing that I would add to that is no one is born with these, right? I mean, the thought process that there are, whether or not it's, okay, well, I was born able to operate a firearm, or I was born with soft skill. It doesn't work that way. Okay. You have to be trained in it, and you have to be constantly developing that training. It's just a necessary requirement.
No.
Yep.
Some of it can come back to Ronin again. It's a toolbox.
Yeah.
Reach into the box, you pull out the tools. And unfortunately, to some people, they only have one tool. But every problem is not a nail.
That's 100% correct.
Agreed.
Well,
we're right about at an hour. So,
guys, thank you for hosting us. I can speak for Tarani here. I mean, this is really fun. We always like kind of nerding out on this stuff, and we're really proud of the book. Like I said, I mean, it's Steve has already got a number of titles under his belt. This is my first one, and it's we're excited about it. We think that people are going to get a lot of value out of it.
Okay. This was a great show. I loved having you guys on here.
Well,
Pete, this is honestly the most professional show we've done in our years of doing this. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there you go. Steve and I are just trying to clean everything up. That's all.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for coming out, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'd love to be on again in the future if that opportunity comes up.
Absolutely.
All right, folks.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, we'll see you all next month.
Have a good night.
Good night, boys.